Okay, let me start with the introductions anyway. But for those of you who are just kind of coming in on the call now, thank you for joining us. We have today an IUA interview, and I'm delighted to say that our guest speaker is Karen Walker. So Karen is Air Transport World's editor-in-chief, as well as Air Transport Group's editor-in-chief for Aviation Week. So welcome, Karen. It's brilliant to have you here with us. Karen will be interviewed by Tom. So Tom is our Senior Market Services Executive from the IUA. And just a little bit of background around these IUA interviews. The HR and Training Committee established these interviews just a few months back, fairly recently. And the intention was to interview people who have interesting, successful careers so that we can hear more about them, learn from their successes as well as their challenges. And certainly, Karen, we're really looking forward to hearing from you today about the aviation industry, and certainly from my perspective, from the HR perspective, about being a senior female in the aviation industry, which is typically a very male-dominated industry as well. So thank you again for joining us. Tom, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Jo. As Jo said, I'm a Senior Market Services Executive at the IUA, and as part of my role, I provide secretarial support to a number of IUA committees, and some of those happen to be the various aviation committees that we have at IUA, including the underwriting and claims groups and our junior aviation underwriting and claims groups, which is a thoroughly enjoyable part of my role. So I'm very pleased to have been asked to speak to Karen Walker today. Thank you very much, Karen, for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to join us. So we are keen to receive questions from those that have dialed in. And I know that there are several people who are unable to dial in, but have had the opportunity to pass on their questions in advance. And I know will be very keen to listen to the recording of this session, which will circulate in a few days' time. So we'll attempt to cover a combination of aviation and HR issues, and that will be the best part of the next hour. I would encourage you to make use of that Q&A function that I mentioned, and we can take those questions as we go. So clearly lots to get through, and I think of some fantastic insights we want to make sure we get across during this time with Karen. So we'll get started straight away, Karen, and we'll kick off, I guess, at the very beginning of your career and try to understand exactly what it was that drew you into the aviation sector and, of course, the world of journalism.
Hey, Tom, and thank you again for this opportunity, and just really looking forward to this conversation. So thank you again. So in terms of how did I get into this, sometimes even I sort of think, how did I get into this? I obviously, like everybody else, was sort of thinking of a career path. English and was definitely a favourite subject. So, that was sort of what I was trying to think. To be honest, I was thinking English school teacher or something along those lines. And then I just ended up getting a scholarship for a journalist course. So it wasn't like I grew up thinking, I want to be a journalist, or certainly not sort of one covering aviation and aerospace. But I got that scholarship, and that led me through. And as part of that, assuming you kept passing the right exams, you got guaranteed a post as a junior reporter at a local newspaper. And so we're talking way back in the 70s here. And if anybody else you're way too young, Tom, to know this, but anybody else might remember from those days that you'd think in those times out of university, you'd think, is there even going to be a job out there? There was high unemployment, etc. And I was incredibly lucky to know that I had this place at a local newspaper. So that's what I did. I started off did the usual rounds as a junior reporter at 2 local newspapers in East Anglia, which is sort of where I was born and grew up at. So now I was actually born on a US Air Force base in East Anglia in Norfolk, not far from the Sandringham estate. And it was, like I say, it was an American Air Force base because my father was in the US Air Force at the time. And RAF Sculthorpe, now closed. But there were a lot of Air Force bases, RAF and US around there, Mildenhall, Lake and Heaths being some of the biggest ones. And so at 6 weeks old, I actually flew on a military transport, a US transport to the US. So that was my first flight because my father got posted back to the US. And then he got posted to Guam. So I spent the first 4 years in the United States, was born an American citizen. And despite this accent, and but at about 4 years old, returned with my English mother and went to school here in there in the UK, because I'm speaking to you from my Washington DC home. And so I ended up doing journalism and doing these local newspaper beats, but I was still in that same area where a lot of these Air Force bases were, and I always loved being able to make an excuse to go and cover something that was going on at the Air Force bases. And so I used to go to W.H. Smith's every Saturday and buy my copy of Flight International, which is a magazine from London that has been going almost as long as the Wright brothers, and used to go and buy my print copy from W.H. Smith's. And I was just always interested in that side of things. And I also just decided I wanted to get into some sort of industry sector. And so that's the one that made sense. I applied for a post that popped up one day in the back of the magazine, advertising for a junior defence reporter. And I really didn't think I had any chance at all. This was back in 82. And but I thought, oh heck, why not at least try it? I got an interview, and to my amazement, even today, I got the job. So that was my break into aviation.
I think there are probably a limited number of people, Karen, that can say they literally born into their industry. So it sounds like you were one of those few people. And you're right to say that my knowledge around that era, and specifically aviation matters, probably not quite up to speed. So if the roles were reversed and you were interviewing me, I think it'd be a very short interview. So I'm glad it is this way around. So by my calculation, then you may have just missed the Greenham Common protests, regarding the cruise missiles, which may have been 81.
Well, that's actually interesting. Yeah, I wasn't actually, covering anything then, even though, by the time I joined, when I joined Flight, it was actually on the military side. But I was very aware of all of that was going on. I was, like I say, I was interested. So yes, I do remember that whole the Greenham Common protests, and I was but that was more sort of like following us from personal interest. When I joined Flight, to be honest, that was a very technical magazine, and what we were covering in those days, there was just every time you turned around, there was a new fighter jet or a new surveillance aircraft or tanker or something being developed. And really, that's what we were covering. We were covering the industry and covering, what was being designed and created, and the competitions. So, I went to my first major air show, with the Paris Air Show, to cover that. And in those days it was incredible, because during the flying display they would have all these different jets, many of which were still at prototype stage, doing displays and in the static display.
And actually, on those lines, I'm sure we'll come back on to strikes actually of a slightly different form when we talk about some of the recent events that we've seen in the industry a little bit later in this discussion. But I wondered if we could, just sticking with the themes of the early time in your career, maybe for you to tell us about some of the very significant events that you worked on quite early in your career. Is there anything that really stands out in the memory?
But like I say, in those early days when I first joined Flight, and then I went to Jane's Defence Weekly, which is also based in the UK, and I went there as technology editor. So again, I was covering military, but the technology side. So yeah, you were, some of the big things that were going on then, of course, shuttle program, and all the technology. I remember when the shuttle launched, took the Hubble scope out, and all the incredible imagery that we saw there. We've now got a sort of a new version of that more recently, but which is fantastic. But that was all going on. Like I say, there was a lot of sort of development of military aircraft, but then when I came to the United States, which was right at the beginning of the 1990s, and by that I mean sort of really returning, but that's where I've lived since then and worked. One of my first assignments that I then did, I moved to Atlanta, but I used to go down to Florida a lot to the space base there at Canaveral, and covered some of the shuttle launches. So that, of course, was fascinating. And this was post the Challenger disaster. So I remember that. I was actually working for Flight at that time, but I was working in Singapore when covering an air show there, when we suddenly heard that the Challenger had exploded. So my team was sort of involved in covering that, but we were based in Singapore at that week. But by the time I sort of actually started to do some of the actual covering of the program, I was that was all behind us. And it was fascinating. You as a journalist covering that, you got a sort of a special pass. You're in a special area that's about as close as a non space person can get to where the launch platform is. And they have this stand and a newsroom. This was all before the internet as well, writing those. So we were still actually sort of writing things out on typewriters and stuff, and faxing copy over. But you could meet the astronauts. By that time, the shuttle program had really, I saw Columbia, Discovery, Endeavour launches. One of the most amazing ones was when I saw a Discovery launch at night time. They are beautiful in the daytime, but at night time they're just spectacular, as you can imagine. And so that element was all fascinating to follow.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people will be very envious of that experience. It sounds absolutely fantastic. And I must admit, mentioning Canaveral has teed me up to ask a slightly light-hearted question, which people may be interested in. So, and we picked up that actually, I think it was in June of this year, NASA announced that they would be setting up a scientific team to spend some time studying UFOs, which I don't think is the first time that they've set up this kind of project, team, or initiative. I wondered if you ever got involved in any of the extraterrestrial reporting that goes on in and around that area.
Sadly, no. As far as I'm aware, I never met an alien, but I never interviewed one. But no, as I say, I mean, I am aware. It's been a long while since I've covered that side of the industry, and clearly we're now seeing a different aspect of that industry emerge now with the commercial space side, and again focus very much on the sort of scientific research and discovery of what's out there. So I sort of keep a sideways eye on it, but I don't follow that. But you're absolutely right. There is, I think, because the more we know, the deeper we can look into space, the more those sorts of questions come up. So I think that's where that whole interest is. Now, I do have some colleagues in my current organization at Aviation Week who are definitely interested in all of that side and take trips out to Roswell, etc.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for enlightening us on that one. So we wanted to try and get a little bit of an idea of how you develop the skills that, of course, you've taken into your current position, which I think will be of value to everyone who is listening, whether live or to the recording of this session. So one of the things that we spoke about briefly the last time I had the opportunity to talk to you was perhaps some times that you've experienced adversity or controversy in your career, and how you've managed to overcome that, and of course build the resilience in order to do so.
Yeah, I think well, let's just start with the obvious that you know, I'm female, and I did, you know, and I joined particularly because I joined as a junior defense reporter, which was the first female at Flight. And so the room, you know, the newsroom was full of, you know, people who were you know, had been in the military, were pilots, were aeronautical engineers, etc., who'd come there, and they were all great. But it was a very, you know, it was a very different world in those days. I mean, it's not that long ago, really, but it was different. You know, for one thing, everybody was smoking in their, you know, at their desks, and so just a different atmosphere. But then in terms of sort of what I was covering, you know, I would go out to cover, for example, you know, I went and covered this big NATO summit in Brussels at the NATO headquarters there. And, you know, there was lots and lots of people, you know, businessmen representing all the military companies, aerospace companies, lots and lots of military people as well, you know, in uniform. And when I went to the opening reception, you know, literally people would come walking up to me to get a drink. They thought I was there to serve cocktails, not to and in those days there really weren't even many women covering. You know, I'm a journalist, I wasn't of the industry, I was a journalist there to cover it, and there were very, very few women doing that on the military side. That's all changed. You know, I mean, we all know that in journalism, you know, you're as likely to see a female as a male, regardless of the industry. I would say most notable, say, in sports. You know, I can remember also, you know, if you go back to you know, I love what I call football, the Americans call soccer, to watch, and you know, you'd never see a woman report cover that. That's all changed. So that's what I've seen. Now, what I cover now and have done for a long while, of course, with Air Transport World and for Aviation Week, is the commercial air transport side, that global industry. And there's certainly, you know, in terms of the journalists who cover that, there's at least as many females as males. But what's interesting, I mean, there is absolutely no reason at all why there aren't at least as many women running airlines or flying airliners as men, right? It's and yet there isn't. And so the industry is going through its the air transport industry is going through its own sort of good hard look at itself at the moment, and really trying to correct that. And we are starting to see a few airline CEOs, nowhere near enough, but it is starting to happen. And of course, we are starting to, you know, see more female pilots. And at the moment, there's a shortage in many parts of the world of pilots that's come after the COVID pandemic. And, you know, one of the big opportunities here is to fill those gaps by attracting women into aviation careers.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's fair to say, Karen, that this subject matter has really been at the heart of lots of things that the insurance industry itself has been doing for some time, in order to strive for, you know, by the sounds of it, the type of balance that you see in journalism. But you know, of course, that you mentioned you don't see from an airline's perspective, and I think we'll definitely come on to some of those hiring concepts, and also talking about shortages that have been experienced post COVID-19, and perhaps the time lag to get juniors actually up to speed in order to be able to carry out their tasks on commercial airliners. So one thing I wanted to try and touch on here is the fact that I think from when we last spoke, you've built some excellent relationships and networks across the aviation industry during your time in your role, and obviously the various roles that you have had. So how important do you think it is for your role, and why should everybody be setting aside time to try to build those types of relationships and connections in their own roles?
Yeah, Tom, that's yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is it first of all, it's knowing it's knowing and understanding your industry. You can't be what we call ourselves B2B journalists, business to business. We're connecting, in my case, I'm connecting the supply chain and the governments and the regulators with the airlines and all that workforce, in terms of sort of providing information that, if I'm doing it correctly, should be useful to their industry. And you can't do that if you don't understand it. So the first thing is to understand it. And so what I'm doing, of course, not just me, obviously we have a team, and it's a team globally, but our team is tracking the day-to-day, who's doing what all the time. We're doing the interviews, we're doing the the one-on-ones. I normally, outside of the pandemic, I travel a lot, because you do need to actually have those one-on-one conversations, and also you can go to events and conferences and learn. So it's really just making sure that you're both tracking it so that you can cover it, obviously, that's my job, but tracking it so that you understand. Because what's interesting, I think, I'll just say this for the air transport industry, obviously you've got lots of people there who are really expert in their jobs. A classic thing is a pilot is trained to, the very specific skill of flying that aircraft. The airline CEOs these days, the people generally in the C-suites, they've usually come from backgrounds of economics and financial types of backgrounds. What's interesting, they know what they've got to do, and their airline really, really well, and their job. And what's really fascinating is how often I get asked the question from these people: what are you hearing? What are you hearing about this? And and so I sort of, I've always seen my role as a sort of, you're joining the dots, if you like, for people, because their job is to be focused on their specific task and mission. Mine is a broader role of sort of, tracking that industry and then communicating, big trends, big changes, etc. And a classic example, if I may, on the air transport side, a big trend that I sort of was like, I've been monitoring for a long while, and then you could really start to see things shift, was the whole sustainability in aviation. As that became no longer just, it's nice, those airlines do have these nice fuel efficient engines, and and it's all good, to where the public became much more, there was much more scrutiny of well, what are how much of the carbon emissions are coming from aviation, and what does that mean, etc. And so that's an area where it was my job to be, we've been doing tracking of that for a long while, and then we were also sort of raising the flag, if you like. This is a very, very serious issue that the industry has to take notice of. So that's all part of the, you've got to have that sort of knowledge, but then, as you say, networking and interaction with the key players across the industry. And the number one thing, and I'm not saying that I've always got it right, I haven't, but the number one thing in journalism is accuracy. that's your credibility. You've got to always strive to be accurate and give useful information, because otherwise you're going to lose your credibility in the industry. So it's multifold.
Yeah, it is, and I totally agree that you sit in a very unique position. I think have a fantastic opportunity to to almost oversee the industry and the various trends and themes that are emerging, and absolutely accuracy. I guess is always going to be number one when it comes to journalism, and I imagine it must be a challenge at times, to separate fact from fiction, and something that we think about internally is that in a competitive environment, it must be challenging also to find ways to capture an audience and to draw the reader in, which I think can be of relevance to anybody in whatever role they do, because we all have to give information across time to time, and we have to make sure that the time that we do have someone's attention, we make the most of that. So I wondered how you go about making sure that you can always separate that fact from fiction, but you always manage to capture that reader's attention and make the most of the time that you have with them, looking at your publication or listening to one of your podcasts.
Yeah, and again, it's sort of when you're in that B2B sector, it's a little different from being in the general media. But we all know that social media has changed that has changed media greatly. And the biggest change is two big changes: the reach, how many more people you can reach, and the speed, and you just said it, Tom. There's a competitive thing there. Then, what's more important, just getting it out there quick, being the first to get it out there, or making sure it's accurate? And I think on the industry side, as a B2B journalist, I think we get a little bit more grace than in the general media side, in that, as I just said, your reputation depends on you getting things correct. And there's a separation there in that I know the airline people, the CEOs and executives are willing to give me an interview that they might not be ready to give to a general media organization. And it depends what's what they're talking about. But what they'll say is, it's just good to talk to someone who knows understands our industry, right? So that gives you a little bit more of a bit more bandwidth to first and foremost make sure it is accurate, as opposed to just race for. We're not a scoop organization, if that's the way of putting it. That's a very old-fashioned word these days anyway. But yes, of course, we've got all the new tools. Well, they're not so new these days, but all the tools that are that people use these days. When the pandemic sort of just shut down travel, and we couldn't be out there physically with people, we got very engaged through webinars, through podcasts, all those types of tools, and they really worked. We really saw people come to those, and we saw executives very willing and happy to join them and do that. So I think we were able to turn some of those around really quickly. And I think, again, it was that sort of the reputation of our organization, of Aviation Week has been, again, it's another, it's based here in the US, but it's global, and it's been going since Wright Brother times. And and has that reputation of really understanding and being accurate.
Thank you, Karen. And we mentioned there the COVID-19 pandemic, and obviously it would be wrong not to talk about the impact that has had on airlines in the aviation sector. And I'm sure we have some keen aviators who have dialed in as well. So we'll move through a few aviation themes now. So obviously the sector has encountered many challenges, I guess, not just in the last few years, but there's plenty more that probably come to mind. But of course, the industry seems to keep coming out the other side. I wondered how you thought COVID-19 and the Russia-Ukraine crisis will impact the industry in the long run. And perhaps when compared to some other very significant events that come to mind, such as 9/11 or the Boeing 737 Max-8 accidents?
Yeah, but good question. So I think the world in general went into shock when we started to realize just the severity of COVID-19 and its impact on literally on human lives, but also in how we live, for the aviation, for the air transport industry, the global industry, it was catastrophic. I clearly remember I'd been on a flight. I went to a conference in February of 2020, and again, this was a classic thing of where I'd been monitoring what was happening in China, and it was very unsettling, right? But there's a little bit of you thinks it's probably going, it could just stay there. We'd seen things like SARS before, and of course lots of concern and lots of impact on a regional basis, but not so much globally. And then this just all sort of started to shift in February. I went to an aviation summit here in DC, and nobody was wearing masks or anything like that at that point, but there was an unease, and there was a lot of people having side conversations, where's this going? And then I took a flight to Phoenix, which was actually a personal one. I had to go to a friend's funeral. And so this was right at the beginning of March, and my nearest airport here to where I live is Washington Reagan, and so that's very close to me here. And in just those few days that I'd been gone, everything had changed. When I came back and landed at Reagan Airport, it was like a ghost town. The shops were all closed, those little silly shops that sell silly things that you don't really need unless you're at an airport. They were already closed down. The place was just empty, and this had just happened very quickly, and suddenly everybody was very scared. Nobody was leaving their homes and stuff, and of course that's had a direct catastrophic impact on the aviation industry or the air transport side, because nobody wanted to fly. There's one exception to that, which is the air cargo side. The cargo carriers, of course, it became more important than ever. They did some incredible, some of their people, some of their pilots and supporters were just incredibly brave. There were no vaccines or anything for them either, and yet they were delivering the vaccine. Well, when the vaccines came, but at the beginning they were delivering medical equipment and food and all these things that were sort of starting to really become in short supply. But on the air transport side, no, I'd never seen anything like it. I sort of lived through 9/11. I was covering the air transport industry then. I was based in an office that was very close to the to Reagan Airport and to the Pentagon, and I was literally, we were trying to make sense and cover. My team was trying to cover the crashes in New York, and then all of a sudden everything around us was filled with black smoke, and that was the American Airlines aircraft that had crashed just very close by. And of course that was devastating. But pandemic is where, first of all, frankly, the number of lives lost is just tragic. But for the airline industry, yeah, I couldn't think of anybody would have expected something that would have brought the entire industry almost to a standstill and for so long. In 2020, that year, the industry as a whole was profitable. It's not a good industry for profits. It's all, the margins are always very thin. It's a complicated industry, but it was profitable. And that year alone, it lost nearly 140 billion that year alone. And I think this year, IATA, International Air Transport Association, which sort of represents most of the world's major airlines. They think that this year that loss will be reduced to about 10 billion. So that's a heck of a lot better, but it just, this was an industry that was profitable, and here we are, by the end of 22, still working to get back to profitability.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's easy to forget actually how important the air cargo industry was during the pandemic, as you'd mentioned there. And I guess from an insurer perspective, it's fair to say that unforeseen events of that kind, particularly when they are global in nature and would of course be considered systemic from a risk perspective, they are a real challenge. So it's fair to say that nobody was quite prepared for what the industry experienced. And something I wanted to ask, because of your your position and experience, obviously what you'll be reporting on day to day, is from your perspective, looking at where we are with workforces at the moment, whether that's on the airport side or on the airline side, do you think we're back to to fighting fitness? As when I say we, I should probably say the aviation sector. Is it back to fighting fitness post pandemic, or do you think there's perhaps still a little way to go before we get there?
There's still a ways to go, but it's looking so much better now than certainly where we were, even I would say even 6 months on, certainly a year ago. One of the big differences, of course, is vaccines, but I think it's also it was interesting when at the worst of the pandemic, when everything stopped, there were people who were saying this will never come back again, the amount of demand for air travel. There was a lot of real pessimism, not necessarily within the industry. There was some, but from outside, people were sort of saying, you know what, people are just going, particularly sort of on the business travel side, people were saying, people have learned now how to connect via Teams and Zoom, etc., etc. They're not going to pay that amount of money now to hold their meetings in real, to go to conventions, etc. I personally never bought that line. I know how much it means for people to do these things in person and for real. So a lot of people said leisure will eventually come back. Well, okay, yes, you could see that you can't, a virtual vacation is never going to be as good as sitting on that beach for real. But I always felt that the business travel would come back, and that's what we're really now seeing happen. Sure, the leisure travel was the first to sort of happen, and you've seen how some of the airports have been completely overwhelmed because people were just like, yes, I could finally go to my son's wedding. Yes, I can have a vacation. Yes, I can see the grandchild I haven't yet met. So there's been that came back, and it's been strong. And it's caused its own issues as they've tried to ramp up, to meet that sudden demand. But I think the really interesting thing now is that you're also seeing the business side come back big. I mean, you look around, there's just conventions everywhere now. People do not see that virtual world as a replacement for how they work. It's a useful extra tool they've learned, but I think that's more the mindset. So that's making a difference. It really still depends on where those border restrictions and testing requirements are being lifted. It's very, very unpersuasive if to go on a business trip if there's a risk of a quarantine hotel, or even multiple tests and things like that. As soon as they lift, so what we're seeing in Asia, for example, is that that's more of a patchwork, and China is the big holdout. They've got this zero COVID policy, so it's pretty much that they had a really fast growing air transport industry, and that's been really slowed down. because of that. But elsewhere in the world, certainly here in the Americas and of course in Europe, where things have opened up, it's coming back. So you know, the the North American airlines, sorry, US and Canada, North American airlines, they're expected to actually get a sort of like an almost $9 billion profit this year. That's way smaller than where they were, but you know, that's good news, and I think you will see the other regions follow.
Yeah, absolutely, Karen, and I just wanted to also vouch for your point there on the downsides of a virtual vacation, which I am really hoping is not something that takes off. I don't think that's in anyone's interest. But what you mentioned there in respect of business travel, it does bring me on to another topic that we've been discussing quite a lot from an IUA aviation committee perspective. And it's that of the climate crisis that is impacting everyone, and of course is impacting the aviation sector. I know you've already mentioned that, but what we've been discussing is actually a proposal that we saw in France not so long ago. I think it was only a couple of months ago, where several MPs in France, and there has since been some support from the French transport minister, have suggested that business jet travel should be limited or banned entirely in light of the impact that the sector is having in contributing to the aviation crisis. Sorry, the climate crisis. So, you know, I guess from my perspective, it'd be interesting to to take your views on that and to see whether you think that's something that we might actually see becoming a bit of a trend and perhaps cropping up elsewhere internationally.
But as I sort of said earlier, the trend of aviation and air transport having to be more sustainable, and by that I mean reducing its carbon emissions, has actually been with us for quite a while. What's changed is certainly the public scrutiny, and that's understandably linked to the big concerns that we're seeing about the numbers and where we're headed if as a whole, as a planet, we don't do something about climate change. And and so I think the aviation for quite a long while was depending very much on the message of it does have very, very new design fuel efficient engines that that have significantly made the industry very, very clean, relatively speaking, as a transport. And then the other thing that came in was what they called carbon offsetting. So there was these international carbon offsetting agreements made, where the industry would, and I'm sure you've probably seen it if you buy a flight, a lot of airlines will now offer you the opportunity to buy an offset to offset your flight. And so that for quite a long while was seen as sort of how the industry was addressing it, and what's changed is that it's clear that that's nowhere near enough. The industry has to actually get itself to what the term now is carbon net zero, right? But that's incredibly difficult because these aircraft run on jet fuel, right? And so there's a huge amount of political and industry efforts going on right now to become. They've just, as a whole, agreed to a 2050 global net zero target. 2050 seems a long way off, but there's a lot that's going to be done between now and then. And a lot of it will depend on being able to use what they call sustainable aviation fuels, which is fuels that come from from other sources, and do not have that carbon issue of conventional jet fuel. So there's that side of it. The problem is there's nowhere near enough of it. It's very expensive. So that needs to be an industry government partnership of how to get that production up much, much wider and faster. So those are that's, you know, a part of the solution. Then the other is to develop aircraft that don't that you have are powered by electric systems, or hybrid electric systems. And there's a lot of work, a huge amount of work going on that. Again, it's expensive, it takes time. And so to go back to what you said, Tom, about France, and you know, it's not just France, but you know, you are seeing a lot of countries, what they're tending to focus on, the politicians, is how to, they're sort of saying the short haul flights, right, is where they're saying, you know, why are you doing those short haul flights? People should be able to, you know, should replace that with trains, etc. First of all, that isn't a solution everywhere. There isn't necessarily that option. But it isn't, I think, and from the industry's perspective, there are much better solutions where the governments and politicians work with the industry to develop and fast track these technologies that can definitely be done.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think, you know, there are probably roles for bodies like IATA that you mentioned, or ICAO to step in and have some kind of role there. And we did pick up the 2050, you know, net zero emissions agreement that we saw, you know, last week or the one before, and I guess, you know, the industry will continue to, you know, to experience some negative press irrespective of these types of agreements until we start seeing those very tangible steps be taken. But I recall actually attending a presentation on sustainable aviation fuels and hybrid aircraft. It could have been, you know, 4 or 5 years ago, but the presenter at the time mentioned that to actually power a commercial airliner with battery power, you would essentially need to fill the entire cabin on that airliner with the batteries in order to be able to do so, which, you know, doesn't seem like a very feasible solution from a business perspective. So, you know, hopefully technology has moved on since then. I think it has, but clearly it will need to do so a little bit more before we're in the position perhaps that we need to be.
You're going to definitely see they're out there now. They're really moving fast. You're going to see, you know, the commuter type of aircraft that you see. You know, you'll often say, oh yeah, that's it, because it's got a propeller, right? That's how you. So those ones, that's really advanced in terms of electric powered versions of those and hybrid electric powered versions of those. So I think that's the first thing you're going to see, and in a surprisingly short time. You know, by the 2030 timeframe, you will almost certainly see those passenger planes. You know, the ones that can take sort of like, you know, maybe 30, maybe 50 people on a regional flight.
Yeah, some of those vertical, you know, the vertical takeoff aircraft, I imagine we're thinking of here.
Yeah,
like
no, these are sort of pretty conventional, to be honest. That and in fact, in some cases, it's the same aircraft frame, but they're just changing how it's powered. So they're pretty normal looking, the designs on that side. The big challenge is when you get to really, you know, to the long haul flights, your transatlantic flights, etc. You know, so you know the sorts of aircraft that what we call wide bodies. You know, the 787s, A350 types of aircraft. There is not the engine technology at this point. There's work being done, but that's a different question. But I think you're going to be surprised at how quickly you see different types of aircraft in terms of how they're powered come in.
Yeah, I think I may have been thinking slightly more into the future with some of the very interesting types of aircraft that we've seen, not quite prototypes, but designed and sketches. You know, these vertical takeoff, you know, almost taxi, you know, in a city vehicles, and actually, you know, all of this is incredibly interesting for, you know, for the insurance sector, who no doubt will be trying to prepare for the way in which technology is going to change and ensure that, you know, the policies that the insurance industry is providing are as relevant as possible and are covering what will be some changing risks. You know, we've already learned when we look at things like lithium-ion batteries that there are underlying risks. You know, fire is one of those, and we see that in respect of, you know, e-scooters, hybrid vehicles. So no doubt all of these things will be, you know, very high on the agenda when we look at new aviation technology. One thing I wanted to pick up, Karen, because I'm conscious we've only got about 10 minutes left, and of course to see if there are any questions that have cropped up. Is to look at something that you've mentioned perhaps right at the start about, you actually getting into the sector and into the industry, and of course it's a challenge for all sectors, certainly the insurance sector, to bring in diverse talent, whether that be school, college, or university leavers. So I was interested in, from your perspective, perhaps what more could be done, whether that's journalism, whether that's the aviation sector or elsewhere, to try and attract people into these careers, which I'm sure you will vouch for, that there are some fantastic careers to be had across the sectors.
It's a really good question, and it's one that a lot of people way smarter than me are putting a lot of effort into now. I think what's interesting right now is that the marketplace, the labor, because of these labor shortages, and it's not just pilots, and it's not just aviation, everywhere you look, there's labor shortages, and so the market has become very competitive, which of course tends to mean it's more expensive, and so, but what that tends to spawn is creativity. People are sort of having to really think hard. How do we get the best people in? Aviation and aerospace tends to be very high skill, high skill sets needed. So it's not, you've either got to get the people that got the skill sets, or we've got to train them, and that's cost and it's time. So there's a lot of competitiveness going on in that, which, like I say, is actually sort of making people a bit more creative, and in terms of how they're thinking, what makes us more attractive to come to our company than that company. And certainly people are sort of this industry, aviation and aerospace industry, is, when it comes to diversity, because it's global, right, there's a very global international culture. That's not the problem, but as we mentioned before, when you look at sort of male versus female, it's not balanced, and there's a lot of work going on there. I think it starts at schools, and there's a lot of campaigns right now. We at Aviation Week, we do a lot of outreach. We have a formal program where we join up and go to universities across the states. We join up with it could be with an airline, or it could be with an aerospace company, and go and particularly to those universities that have specialties in aeronautics, etc., so that we can meet the students, tell them a bit about the industry, tell them about ourselves, get and start that connections and relationships really early, while they're still at university and still thinking about where they want to go in their careers. So everybody can do some of that outreach to schools and universities, and then I think you just also have to look at your workplace and say, in today's post-pandemic world, how do people what do they want from their work lives and their careers, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Karen. I think that's fantastic advice. So I think Joe will probably come back in now to take a look at the question we have in the chat, and then certainly I've got a couple that have been sent to me in advance, which I'd be pleased to add to anything that Joe has. And just from my perspective, before we do that, Karen, I just wanted to say thank you very much for your time and allowing me to ask some questions to you.
Thank you, Tom.
And I'll reiterate that as well. Thank you, Karen. Fascinating stuff, and interesting to hear about the career challenges, which aren't that different from the career challenges and kind of recruitment challenges we're facing in the insurance market as well. But we do have one question in the chat box, and that is, do you think it is possible to have a senior career in aviation without needing to travel extensively when you have a young family, or do you think your career can't advance without traveling to build those face-to-face relationships?
Good question. Hard question.
Yeah.
Right. I don't think not everybody. Again, if we're talking about aviation, and who's somebody who's joined an airline or an aviation company or an aerospace company, you know, a lot of those don't need to travel, right? It very much depends, you know. I mean, I think if you think of the obvious, you know, if you're sort of an aeronautical engineer or somebody who's working on, you know, actually at the design and factory, you might not. It will depend on the job. Okay, if you're talking about if it's more about, because this question says face-to-face relationships, you know, again, it will depend on your job. Do you need to have, you know, I mean, I do know of people in this industry who travel a lot, you know, and they clearly do need and value the face-to-face. But I don't think it's necessary. I mean, I guess if you're a flight attendant or a pilot, you're probably going to expect to travel. But even then, you see, they will go for different career option routes. You know, some people will want to work on routes that are you know, what we call domestic, or sort of, you know, short, in other words, so they get home every day, and others like the, you know, the long haul travel. So I think the options are there.
Thank you. I think I'd probably add that actually in any senior role in a global industry or organization where you're dealing with people from different countries, I think there is becoming more of an acceptance that you do not have to travel if that is your personal choice and you have reasons for doing so, given the amount we all use our kind of virtual technologies nowadays. But Tom, do you have some more questions as well?
Yeah, one that was provided to me in advance. So, Karen, if you could give yourself one piece of advice when you started out in your first role in journalism, what do you think that would be?
Oh heck, as you know, at that age, you think you know it all, don't you? You think you think you're going to end up being, you know, at the top of this and the, you know, so maybe the bit of advice I most needed to tell myself then was sort of humble up, Karen, and just accept you don't know anything at this stage. It's I think, you know, ultimately it's sort of follow your instincts, and that may sound really too loose, but I think some people do feel like they're supposed to go on a certain career track, and if something in you is telling you, you know, I really I would really love to do this. I know, you know, I know why I'm doing this. Maybe it's because, you know, everybody in your family was a doctor or whatever, and it's a, you know, a noble profession. Or maybe you're doing something because that seemed like the best money option. Or maybe you've got yourself into a really good money option, you know, a well-paid job, and yet you're not really happy, but you feel like, well, I can't change that because of the money. If something is telling you, I would love to do what, if I really, you know, was honest, I would love to do this, I'd say go for it. Doing what you love is always going to, I feel so lucky that I am paid to do something I love. And you know, and then you know, everything will fall into place from there. And I know that, you know, I'm talking as a journalist who's incredibly lucky to be following this particularly fascinating industry. But I know I come across people in aviation and I love them. I always say this air transport isn't about planes and engines, it's about the people that run airlines and fly airlines. And I still, to this day, I love being in an airport and watching people. You know, watching, you know, oh, there's going to be an argument there, or, you know, that little kid's not going to stay quiet for much longer, and things like that, and how's people handling everything. And that's why I love dealing with aviation people, because they're real people, and they're passionate about what they do. And you know, we say, you know, people get the bug, you know, they're in aviation now and they probably won't leave it. So there's lots of other fantastic career opportunities out there, and tracks. There really are, and that's all I'm really saying. If there's something in you that's saying, I often wish I was doing that, I would say go for it.
Yeah, we can only hope, Karen, that people say the same thing about the insurance sector.
It,
We can only
uh,
hope.
yeah, I think it, but I think that people can find what they're really into in many different sectors, and really enjoy it. And if you're enjoying it, it becomes a really fascinating industry then, whatever you're doing.
Absolutely.